Hello and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This episode, Bridge and I are wading into the conversation about ageing gracefully, or maybe disgracefully. What is ageing all about? What's our own approach to it? And what does ageing mean for leaders? Come and join us for Being Your Age. Disgracefully. Hello, Bridge. You're on mute. You silly old woman.
Yay. So how old are you feeling today, Bobby?
Well, I am feeling okay at the moment, I guess. I'm just sort of like watching you on your video talking and me not being able to hear a thing. I don't think it's my hearing going yet, but there we go.
Right. Well, yay for my menopausal brain. So the World Economic Forum says between 2015 and 2050, the proportion of over 60s will almost double.
Wow. I can't even get my head around that.
Yeah, incredible, huh? So lots of clever financial institutions are doing lots and lots of analysis about what impact that's going to have on the workforce and the impact. And so obviously in terms of policies for governments, et cetera, all very sort of highfalutin political stuff, but also lots of consideration of and need for conversation about what that means for organizations.
Yeah, because, and I guess I'm just sitting here thinking about that it's everyone in the organization. And then, as we rightly point out, the leaders who, well, we know when we look at demographics, the sort of age that they actually are. So they'll be part and parcel of that. And what effect that has on the younger demographics joining the organisation.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the sort of thinking at the moment, well, there's obviously a whole load to unpack, but two things that came out to me in terms of dealing with the ageing population rather than how it impacts on the younger generation is, there needs to be a huge amount of investment in learning and development, because if there are going to be old employees staying on for longer, then obviously they need to develop their skill sets, which will be different from the skill sets they needed when they first joined an organization or when they're joining new organizations. So, all of this stuff, I think we've had discussions about tech and use of AI, use of online whiteboard apps, etc., use of Zoom, and the sort of stereotype, the mocking stereotype of you're on mute, which I have obviously demonstrated this morning. So there's a huge amount of need to invest in learning and development, and also a change focus on working conditions. This idea that health and well-being are obviously important for everyone, but as we get older, we have different needs in terms of health and well-being, and organizations need to take that into account if they are going to fully leverage and embrace the increased age of the workforce.
I think it's so interesting because I'm sitting here wondering, probably with my beginning to age brain, quite how to articulate what I'm thinking with what you're saying, and throwing another little bit in as well. So let me give it a go. So we are talking about an aging population who, given society, are likely to still be at work for quite a long time to come. And as you are rightly pointing out, how do we keep them current in their learning? Now, that's something about what the organisation needs to be doing. But I think that there's something fundamental here as well about how does the ageing individual feel about themselves in what I'd refer to as their second half of life. And I came across a book, which I have now ordered because I'm going to read it, by a chap called Richard Rohr, called Falling Upward. And he talks about that second half of life. People are often focusing in on growing old, their health, letting go of stuff, or there is this mindset around, in actual fact, you're not losing stuff, you're gaining stuff, so that you are, rather than falling down or falling away, you're falling upward. And I really like the idea of that, because it sort of, I hope I'm making some level of sense, but it sort of goes to the point that second half of life, if that's what it's okay to articulate it as, is not necessarily chronological, but more about how we will orientate ourselves and our attitude. So whilst the organisation can be looking about the learning and development for having that older workforce working for them and keeping them current, that those older individuals have got to have the attitude of mind that they want to still be learning and growing, but potentially at a different pace or whatever it might be in that new phase that they're coming into. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, as you're talking about that, I had this really clear image in my head of, do you remember the Pixar movie Up?
Yes.
The man in the house with the balloon. That's what I was thinking about when you were talking about falling upwards.
Absolutely it. Yeah. Yeah, and if you think about him in that movie, I mean, I remember sobbing my eyes out at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, this is a spoiler alert for everybody, when he loses his wife and he's devastated. You know, and you think about that attitude that he actually has until he gets himself back into the present with that little lad and changes his whole outlook. And I think that potentially, even though I haven't read the book, that's exactly what Richard Rohr is pointing to about growing more, almost sometimes by doing the wrong things rather than the right things, or growing more as a result of things being limited or changing. And I think that is definitely worth a thought of how we are going to have this larger potential proportion of older people in the workforce and how that works. And as I say, I know that we're focusing on that, but I don't think it can be separated from the other demographics that will help these people in their mindset to keep them current.
I completely agree. And I think that there is a big issue. I think you touched on it a little bit, that, you know, this idea of this older workforce, older people staying in the workforce longer can be worrying for younger generation who kind of, you know, if we see things in terms of, dare I say it, dead man's shoes, dead person's shoes, or, you know, this view that there's a cake and the longer that the older people stay, that there's less cake for the younger people. And, you know, I'm always a great believer in, you know, that cake analogy is just bake more cake. So rather than argue about who should have a cake. But yeah, no, there's a real potential for this sort of intergenerational war. And we already see it, you know, because actually ageism occurs at every age. Like, young people are dismissed as not having enough experience, etc., or may not be given opportunities because, you know, that people think that either they don't have the experience or buy into the stereotypes of Gen Z, they don't want to work, they're lazy, they're snowflakes, etc., etc. And then the same, you know, with the idea of, as people get older, well, they're stuck in their ways, they don't know what's going on, they're not tech savvy, they're grumpy, it's time for them to move aside, or they're past it. And so I was interested to see that only 8% of organizations include age as part of DEI strategy. So actually ageism throughout the spectrum isn't something that is generally focused on. And even if they do include it, they mostly focus on, rather than addressing the reality that different things impact us at different stages of our lives, and having to acknowledge that if we're going to make things fair for everyone, then we do need to acknowledge that there are different things that, you know, there's different focuses at different times of our lives, and we need different supports to succeed at different times of our lives. And I can't remember the name of who wrote this book, called Gentelligence, and then an article which I'll put into the resources on the website afterwards. But the book itself focuses on how to embrace and leverage generational differences so they can support each other, recognize each other's differences, celebrate the differences, and look at all of the strengths that we bring, just like we do in any kind of diverse team to acknowledge where the strengths are and leverage those, so that you can have, for example, mentoring. So you can have reverse mentoring, mentors mentoring older people in terms of maybe their journey in terms of embracing more tech, and older people mentoring younger people in terms of networking, social engagement, and maybe some things that Gen Z are stereotypically thought to not have a strength in. But there's an article that accompanies it and really gives a whole load of really useful tasks to encourage that intergenerational understanding and collaboration. I'm not going to go through it, but really it comes down to a lot of stuff that we talk about all the time: talking, empathy, conversations, recognition of strengths. And I do think that's going to have to be something that leaders are going to have to be much, much more aware of as we go towards 2050, where, like it or not, there's going to be a whole load more of people who are over 60.
I love that. And I guess where I would be advising any leader to start from, take a look at your own family. So if I have my family all sat down together for dinner or whatever at the same time, we're ranging in age from 2.5 to 87, with, I think I'm right now saying, every decade. Yes.
Wow.
Every decade accounted for in between as well. Maybe not 70s. No, maybe not 70s. Oh, yeah, well, we actually had an in-laws, yes, as well. So we're covering the whole spectrum, which I actually think is a great place for learning. I think I've said that before about being around my littlies, my grandson and my nieces, and what I learned from them. But, you know, kids in 20s and 30s, I shouldn't call them kids, should I? But you know, their pressures and challenges and strengths. And then there's my brother, my husband and I in the 50, 60 realm. And I suppose when I was looking at this and that business about aging, that I guess I have to acknowledge sometimes that, you know, when I think of my mum, bless her, who did make it into her 80s, but that once you'd heard a story once, you might then hear it 100 times. But for somebody, it was the first time that they'd actually heard it. And I don't think I ever really appreciated that. And so I'd often find myself saying, oh, Mum, we've already heard that story. People have to say it to me now because I tell the same story more than once. And so I'm already in that realm, so that trying to remain relevant or continuing to have a voice, you know, I think sometimes, and here's the practicality of it, sometimes hearing goes. And so when I think about all of us sat around the table together, oh my God, it's like a nightclub. It's so noisy. And so for those in the older category, that's just a bit too much. And you see them quietening down. So that acknowledgement of doing something where you can have more of a one-to-one conversation with them so that they still feel their worth. So I think what I'm saying is that there is a real test bed in my own family going on about learning and play, the advisory and the learning, and the making sure that everybody has worth and the learning. So I don't know what your article says about Gentelligence, but from my own practical application of that, that's some of the things that I find just when I sit down for a roast dinner.
And that's great. It kind of makes me really sad when you see all of this sort of division between the generations. And obviously, I guess in some cultures, it's different because in some cultures, as you age, you are revered and valued. And in much more in the global north, I guess, you know, age is not viewed as something that is a good thing. And so I'd love the point to go back to what you said earlier on about how people feel in themselves as they get older. Because I do think that there is, for many people as they get older, a sense of loss. There's grief in a way for their lost youth. There is maybe fear of the future and in acknowledgement of their sort of loss of their place in society. you know, we see it a lot particularly in women. I can only speak for how I feel. But, you know, that I've talked about this idea of the crone, and, you know, that in the Western world, the crone is viewed as this sort of haggard old woman and something to laugh at, something to throw stones at, the witch. And yet the lovely Gabby, our friend, had mentioned to me at my birthday that actually crone means crown, and that it was previously the crown given to the wise woman, and who was celebrated and gave their knowledge and wisdom to the rest of the group. So I do think that we can feel conflicted in terms of as we get older. And then I think that does sometimes cause, you know, that boomer lash out. You know, Gen X don't do it because Gen X don't care. We're just the cynical generation. We're like, well, I saw the videos on social media of Gen X going, yeah, we don't care. But actually, I think, you know, I'm Gen X, you're Gen X. I do think that we care very much about how many of us do, how we fit into society, what value we still have to give. And we worry about all kinds of things, particularly about our health. And maybe that does come out as sometimes a bit of a lash out at the younger generation. There's a little bit of jealousy there. But quite frankly, I'm regularly amazed and in awe of younger generations in terms of how they cope. I'm kind of glad I don't have to cope with a lot of the things they have to cope with now. But in terms of their ability to set boundaries, to prioritize their health, to prioritize what they want and understand what they want in the world, I think that the sooner we stop looking at these sort of, they do this, and actually go, these amazing superpowers that all of us have, let's start to embrace them. And you've talked about it previously, looking at people as, you know, persons, looking at the person rather than just generalizing about people. I think that we can be amazingly strong in terms of organizations and teams, but it does take good leadership to maybe direct that sort of information or that sort of light bulb moment.
So I don't know if you want to go down this little route for a while, because this business about leadership, but where age fits in. I came across this amazing article by this lady called Helena Clayton around eldership. So you mentioned just a little bit back about the fact that in some societies, you know, elders are revered, and maybe not so much in our society. And she's quoted from somewhere that eldership, that the level of that is defined as sentinel species of humanness. I really like that. I was like, it's quite like, woo, but I was like, oh, let's read more. And so she has written this article, and again, we'll add it in, about eldership and how that applies to leadership. And so there's just a few things that she says. So she talks about seeing the biggest picture, not just the bigger picture. So somebody in that level of eldership takes even more than a holistic view. They understand the complexities of in a situation. They understand the consequences of something. They focus on interrelational systems, and they hold multiple thoughts and ideologies all at once. I'm like, oh my God, who is this person, and can I meet them? And Robert Keegan, who we've mentioned before in his book, An Everyone Culture, he says that somebody like that is probably about 1% of the population. So rather than being too defeatist about that, because I'm not sure that I'd make it into the 1% of the population, you know, Helena then goes on to say, so what do leaders do to get anywhere close to that? And again, we're back to the things that we talk about: curiosity, expanding our group, love and compassion and communication. I love this one because she talks about deep insight, wisdom and awareness, where you are somebody who helps others make sense of their experiences, can put life events into context, and will sit and learn with somebody. That sounds really to me a bit like a coach or a mentor. So again, that style of leadership, I think, is playing a part as you are getting into midlife and older. She talks about being in service to the world, and that really played to me about the service leadership piece that I know that we want to do more on at some point. But that statement, you first, me after. So leaders, whilst you have to be focusing on delivery and performance, what else are your organisations being activists for, being campaigners for? The corporate social responsibility strategy. If we start from there, you are something in a bigger part of the world than just you yourself or your organisation. And then the fourth one, which you've mentioned before, but this deepened by diminishment, that ageing people may well be frailer, they'll have been through a lot, they'll have cocked some things up, there's flaws, they will have lost things and people, there will have been disappointment. There's this level of acceptance and deepening because of all these things that have happened. And I thought all of those were, and again, from a leadership perspective with that, it's almost like getting to grips with your own limitations so that you can then help and support others with theirs. So I think it's a great article to correlate eldership, that aging, with leadership, and showing just quite how worthy those with more experience, wisdom and age are, and how relevant they remain in the workplace. And I guess that doesn't need to just be the leader, but if we bring it all the way back to our workforce population of older people, all of those can apply.
Yeah. And I love that idea of eldership. That reminds me of, have you heard of the Elders? So it's a group that was started by Nelson Mandela for his 89th birthday, with Desmond Tutu and Kofi Annan, Mary Robinson. There's a whole load of other people, and they're basically a group of activists, human rights advisors, people who've got huge experience on the global stage. And they make comments about and raise awareness for lots of things, but kind of cross national. So it's a global organization. And I love every time I see that the elders have made some form of statement, it is sort of an epitome of what you're saying, this sort of wise leadership, but for others, and seeing that sort of global picture rather than being limited to when they were high ranking politicians or in their own country. So rather than being limited to national considerations, they look at the benefit of humanity as a wider objective. So yeah, that really is demonstrative of eldership. And I love, the elders. If I'll put a link in so you can see sort of what they do. It's amazing.
Yeah, because Helena's question is, what other ways our growth and service are making a contribution to the well-being or humanness of those around us? And it strikes me that the elders are doing exactly that. It's a big question. It's a big question to answer for leaders, for us. But I think it's a great question, even if it's one person at a time.
Absolutely. And because again, they are, like, I assume that they're kind of like the 1%. And I do like that idea of, let's not be off put by the fact that there are some sort of super beings out there who embody everything, but we can make little steps, and all of us can do small things that take us that one step closer to that eldership. But I'm also interested in, I was looking at, this idea of how do we cross this, what often seems to be quite a big divide of generations. And often, in organizations, the voices that are heard the most are older people because they're on the board, that maybe there's they're not the people who are making decisions are not getting all the information that would be useful, especially if you've got an organization that is delivering a product that is aimed at part of the younger generation, but decisions still being made by people who are outside that generation. And also sort of taking into account that at the moment, the older generations also have a lot of spending power. And so they shouldn't be ignored in terms of decisions. So how do we sort of cross this barrier? And I saw this idea, and I've been speaking to other people in NGOs where they have shadow boards. I don't know if you've come across these, where effectively there's an advisory board where a younger demographic and then non-executive employees, they are chosen, volunteered, I'm not quite sure necessarily how it always works, to give a new perspective and insight to the company's leadership team, where you have this sort of discord of older people making decisions that are impacting younger people. And it can be uncomfortable. It's quite a new idea, but it can be really powerful when it's done well, and when the shadow board are supported and understand exactly what their roles are, etc., etc. Have you ever worked in organizations that have shadow boards?
No, sadly not. But interestingly, we're going to be in another episode talking about belonging. And when I was looking at my research for that, I came across personal advisory boards, which I think are the same thing that you're talking about, where it's collecting that diverse group around you to feed back on behaviours, or, you know, to do with the demographics, but can be wide, but the demographics in its widest sense. I suppose that the closest that I got to it was employee forums, where listening to the employee voice. So they perhaps didn't have the same level of authority or governance as such as the main board, but I like to hope, well, I think that is true in the reality of that I gave them more teeth than they ever had before. But was very, you know, because I think that they had been, you know, people were paying lip service to, oh yeah, we've got an employee forum, or we've got a staff forum, or whatever it might be. And then not really giving them anything to do, but actually really making them integral part of restructuring, where, you know, there was a level at some of the time to be saying, be careful what you wish for, because I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to ask you to come back with feedback. You have to speak on behalf of the whole organisation, on behalf of the staff. So I will be asking you whether you've spoken to 5 people or 500. Now, not necessarily 500, but they needed to make sure that their stuff was statistically evidenced as such, as factual, rather than a chat at the water cooler. But I did get so much from having conversations at the coalface, you know, with people on the front line, and being able to we're back to talking about bridges again, aren't we? But being able to say to those people slightly in ivory towers and what have you, I'm sorry, but that's just not right. You know, if you're talking and listening to the voice of the organisation, this is what's going on. But to have them being at the side to be actually making organisational decisions is great and very powerful. And I'm wondering just quite how many of the leaders that I've worked with will be wriggling in their seats right now, even contemplating doing it.
Yeah, the article's really useful, so I'll share that. They don't necessarily make the decisions, but they are the sounding board for the board.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also, you know, what they do is they identify the demographic that they need to hear from. So I first heard about them, so I wasn't really aware of them, when I was at a leadership meeting with the Wheel, which is effectively an advocacy forum for a lot of non-profits, NGOs in Ireland. And one of the speakers gave an example of the fact that they have a shadow board of quite young, I think under 20-year-olds, and said that, yeah, it's not comfortable. So yes, like, you know, the shifting in the seat of the CEO, COO, CFO is all completely justifiable, because it was very clear it wasn't comfortable. But what I found really interesting, and the example they'd given, was that this is a large country house with large land, and it's a space for people to come and look at the house and spend time in the gardens. And so it's not profit. But one of the ways that they raise a lot of the money for the rest of the year is by selling Christmas trees. So growing, harvesting and selling Christmas trees. And the shadow board told them they wanted them to stop because it wasn't environmentally friendly and it wasn't sustainable. And that actually they put their money where their mouths were. You know, it could have been really easy to go, yeah, thanks for the input, but you have no idea. We've got this massive financial need and we're not going to sacrifice it for snowflakes that you are. And instead, what they did is they changed the model and they rent Christmas trees. So they grow them and they dig them up and they rent them and then they put them back in the ground.
Yeah, I've seen that, which is brilliant. And I think that is a grand example of that, the different ages coming together to solve. And I think the interesting thing is when we go back to your research about the aging workforce, those people who are currently sitting on the shadow boards are our leaders of the future on the main board. And they then have to create a shadow board probably of 50 to 65-year-olds to make sure that they are listening to the aging workforce. There will be an absolute change of roles in the next X amount of years as a result of where we currently are. So I think it's amazing that people are starting those, and I really hope that those people sat on those shadow boards now, personal advisory boards, whatever you want to call them, are remembering about having their voice heard for when they actually become the people who need to be listening to other voices.
Yes. Yeah, really insightful. Now, so one thing that we haven't touched on
is growing old disgracefully. Come on, let's get there.
Yeah, well, actually, I was going to talk, just to throw in, because we're both women and it would be weird for us not to discuss it, is the menopause and how that impacts on us. And I say it because actually there's now in the UK, there's new guidance from the EHRC about menopause in the workplace under the Equality Act of 2020, that if menopause symptoms amount to a disability, then the employer has to make reasonable adjustments. So it's not just women, we have to talk about it because of that. There's it really does impact on organizations having to take this into account now. And the reasonable adjustments might be things like a quiet room to go and just have a bit of a breath. But for me, I would want punch bags in the quiet room, because I know that during my menopause,
I'd want air conditioning.
Well, they said for the quiet room, I'd want punch bags so I could punch bags, not people. And then they also talk about fans, cooling systems, the potential for a uniform change so that, you can wear cotton or things that aren't, clingy, or things that are comfortable when you are having your own personal summer, and potentially flexible working if that's possible. So, yeah, I mean, it is something that up until, maybe 10 years ago, nobody would talk about. Now nobody can stop talking about it. But something that somebody flagged to me, a man I was talking to, and I was talking about, we were talking about the fact that as women get older, there is this menopause. Many women suffer horribly during the perimenopause and need support through that. I still remember doing some explosive ordnance clearance in Gaza in 2021 when I was going through the perimenopause, and it was blisteringly hot, and anyone who knows me will know that I'm a bit of a hobbit, and none of the ladders I could find actually reached up to the places I needed to go and do the checks that I needed to check. So I was regularly sort of climbing to the top, balancing on these fairly rickety ladders on my tiptoes, trying to pull myself up onto roofs or into crawl holes with my little legs sort of waggling at the back, and then going through hot sweats as well while wearing a helmet and my PPE. So I actually recorded a LinkedIn video just to say hi, just a shout out to all the ladies who are suffering from perimenopause symptoms at the moment, because I'm feeling your pain right now. But that men go through, not all men, there is an andropause, right?
So men also,
And not all men, the sort of symptoms of that are not, for most men, not as acute as at the perimenopause. But it is a time where some men really do suffer from andropause symptoms. And that is something that is really not talked about at all in the workplace. And for many reasons why, men are not encouraged to show vulnerability. They're not encouraged to talk about these things. There's a huge issue about the, that drop in testosterone being linked to their masculinity and their identity. And so as a woman who, you know, my fertility, my youth is also linked to my identity, I can empathize with men who might be suffering from those symptoms more maybe than other men who might sort of nudge and snigger and laugh about it because that's their initial reaction rather than actually feeling they're just glad it's not happening to them. So,
Yeah.
you know, there are health issues that occur as we get older that we need to empathize, understand, and support people through. And while menopause it's got lots of flag waving at the moment, and quite justifiably too, as someone who's gone through it, I do think that we need to just recognize that there are all kinds of other issues that are going on for people as they age, including, as you said, you know, the hearing issue, which can be really, really isolating if it isn't addressed.
It's back to the shadow board or the collecting of people together and making it the conversation, and not necessarily just for one gender. You know, that collective experience of a changing in health, a changing in energy, whatever it might be. I love this quote that I found about it's not about losing your spark, it's about kindling it differently. And I think that absolutely applies when thinking about the menopause or the andropause. You know, that, well, I definitely didn't need any bloody kindling. I needed all of the flipping windows open before I tried to strangle somebody. But you get my point, that it's about kindling life differently. I really like that. And I think that whilst we talk about reasonable adjustments for other parts of, you know, the demographics or whatever it might be, that needs to be playing a part in what we're looking at in organisations in this day and age. I really do. I agree. I have to tell a little story when you're saying about trying to scrag yourself up onto ladders, because I've talked about it more recently. The family still wet themselves laughing every time the story is told about my absolute catastrophical incident at Go Ape, where I landed in the cargo net and couldn't climb up it, and had Ash hanging on one tree trying to explain to me how to climb up a frigging cargo net, and my brother on the other. It was like Dolby surround sound. And I eventually had a toddler tantrum and screamed at the top of my voice. My children all disappeared in different directions into the forest. Andy went to find somebody to help, saying, "There's a woman in distress." He didn't. He disowned me completely.
Shame on him.
Well, I can understand if I look back on it now, quite with the tantrum I was having and screaming, "Get me an effing person to get me down off this effing rope right now," and crying like a baby. But when I look back at the family, think it's all hilarious. I can just about laugh about it now. But that moment of realizing, you know, somebody who has thrown hammer, javelin, shot put, been really strong upper bodily, who can't hoik herself up a cargo net anymore, there was just an absolute moment of meltdown when I realized that I'd met my limitation. Yeah. And, you know, along with the perimenopause and the sweating and everything else, I went absolutely banzai. It's probably the worst moment in that period. But I hear you. But family, I could have done without you laughing and continuing to laugh about it, even if it is a little bit amusing, because it was horrid at the time. So there.
Bless you. And I hope that I wouldn't have laughed if I'd been there, but I can't guarantee.
I think everybody did. It's a fair one. It's a fair one.
But yeah, I was going to say that's just a little bit of disgraceful aging, and I think we would be remiss of us not to mention the poem.
Yes, I have it here. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, go for it.
Right. When I am an old woman, I shall wear purple with a red hat which doesn't go and doesn't suit me. And I shall spend my pension on brandy and summer gloves and satin sandals and say we've no money for butter. I shall sit down on the pavement when I'm tired and gobble up samples in shops and press alarm bells and run my stick along the public railings and make up for the sobriety of my youth. You know, I wish. I shall go out in my slippers in the rain and pick flowers in other people's gardens and learn to spit. You can wear terrible shirts and grow more fat and eat 3 pounds of sausages at a go, or only bread and a pickle for a week, and hoard pens and pencils and beer mats and things in boxes. But now we must have clothes that keep us dry and pay our rent and not swear in the street and set a good example for the children. We must have friends to dinner and read the papers. But maybe I ought to practice a little now, so people who know me are not too shocked and surprised when suddenly I am old and start to wear purple.
That poem. I think we're doing all of those things now, Bobby. Have you got a quote as well?
From Samuel Ullman. Years may wrinkle the skin, but to give up enthusiasm wrinkles the soul.
Yes, totally agree. I don't think we could ever be accused of a lack of enthusiasm about life, so
absolutely not. Long may it continue.
Thank you so much, and I'll speak to you next week.
Thanks, Bridge. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening. For those of you like me who are getting more and more forgetful, the resources are on the website and our Spotify podcast page, so you can read, watch through at your leisure. Next week, Bobby and I are going to have a look at the blame game and how it impacts on organisations being able to properly leverage lessons learned in being blame-free with accountability. See you then.